My guest today is Dr. Foy Scalf, who's head of research archives at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the use of funerary texts in 1st to 3rd century Egypt at the demise of indigenous funerary practices and scripts. He is interested in how language, text, and ritual practice interact and influence each other. Welcome, Foy.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice seeing you. So I want to start with one of your papers, perhaps maybe an earlier paper. So it's entitled From the Beginning to the End, How to Generate and Transmit Funerary Texts in Ancient Egypt. With a continuous tradition, you say here, spanning more than 2 millennia, funerary texts from ancient Egypt offer an excellent data set for studying how compositions were composed and passed on in the ancient Near East. Clear evidence demonstrates the importance and mechanics of scribal copying in the transmission process. What remain less clear are the methods by which new compositions were created. So I want to get to the details of this, Foy. I know nothing about Egypt or any of this stuff. But I was curious. So how do you? I mean, we're talking about 5,000 years ago, and we're getting bits and pieces of information from a variety of channels, I would imagine. So how do you study this? I mean, could you talk a little bit about the process of getting data, getting information, processing that, and reaching conclusions, and so on?
Sure. I mean, first off, I think there's fundamental components to the process, like any other researcher in any other discipline, whether it's humanities or hard sciences. And for us, step one is learning how to read the scripts and languages, right? For something like ancient Egypt, it's the first hurdle for young students who come into the field. And to be perfectly frank, even for seasoned researchers, I mean, as you mentioned, we have a long span of time that we're dealing with. So yeah, roughly, let's say from 3000 BC all the way down into the early Roman period, or even, let's say, up into the 4th and 5th century AD, when the use of hieroglyphs and the other scripts in ancient Egypt come to an end. So part one is, I would not use the term mastering, but part one is to get really deep into the language and the scripts that are being used. And then depending on where you end up focusing as a scholar, dealing with those primary source materials. So for sure, that's step one, is learning the languages and scripts that you need to know. And then we have roughly 2 centuries of scholarship that you need to start absorbing, where we're going to draw that data from, right? So lots of publications of those primary source materials. So for example, to go back to the article that you mentioned that we're sort of discussing, that starts actually at the end of the tradition. So when I was working on my PhD at the University of Chicago, I was sort of, I started with a corpus of material that hadn't been studied as much as others, and it hadn't really had dedicated scholarship to it as a group. And these are mostly texts that are written on papyri, not only on papyri, but mostly. And they're being used in the 1st and 2nd century, maybe even up into the 3rd century AD. And it was sort of looking at those. And what was interesting about those is, in general format, they look and act and function very similarly to earlier corpora of texts that we have from Egypt. And as you mentioned in the title, this is actually a term I try to avoid now, but in the title of that paper, I call them funerary texts.
Yes.
But I just want to maybe make a quick note. We call them funerary texts mostly because they are found in graves in ancient Egypt. So it's a bit of a misnomer, because sometimes we use that term and it mixes up form and function, so that this manuscript, or some of these manuscripts, were used functionally as a funerary text because they were put into a grave, but formally they're not necessarily funerary text themselves, like the compositions themselves. So these 1st and 2nd century AD manuscripts, which were written in Demotic, formally and the way they functioned was similar to things like the Book of the Dead, which many people have heard of from ancient Egypt and earlier texts. But the compositions themselves were not directly drawn from them. And so one of the things that I was trying to do in that research is figure out, where did these things come from, right? Like, why did scribes and people in ancient Egypt in this period decide to write these particular texts down in the way that they did? And this is where maybe the new part of the research was sort of interesting. There is, when you look at the primary source material, so you have these, it's roughly a corpus of about 50 documents that were written. You can see that phrases from those documents are found in earlier material, but not in papyri placed in tombs, but in inscriptions that people left inscribed on walls. So what we often call graffiti, and we have to be careful with this term graffiti because, of course, the modern usage has a sense of like illicitness to it, right? Which didn't necessarily apply for the ancient material. But in any case, so some of these passages, these little phrases are found in this graffiti. And what's really interesting is exactly what you would hypothesize happens in the text. That is, you have these phrases and they're of certain grammatical variety. And when they're pulled into these slightly longer compositions, the grammar is adjusted just a little bit. You can still see the vocabulary is directly coming from these graffiti, but they change the grammar just a little bit so that it's slotted into a narrative format in these texts. And what then that led me to is things that I'm actually still studying now. I have some more research coming out about this later this year, is the influence of oral traditions on the written traditions. And the reason this works for this particular research is because when somebody in ancient Egypt visits a temple and they inscribe a graffito on a wall, nobody thinks they like pulled a papyrus sheet out of their pocket and copied it onto the wall, right? Because one thing, and please jump in if you want me to slow down on some of this, but some of this, like there's an issue in our scholarship where what's often called the reproductive and the productive tradition. That is, some people think that ancient scribes were just copying other texts, and they separate the copying from the writing anew. And so because graffiti are not written as a copy, it shows you that people were carrying these phrases around in their head. They wrote them out and then later contextualized them.
Yeah. So what I'm understanding, Foy, is that funerary texts, what we find along with the things they buried, are not necessarily made for that. It is sort of colloquial. I don't know if colloquial is the right term, but the text existed for a variety of purposes. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they want to embed this sort of like some sort of instruction. So I believe Egyptians thought death is just a start of a long journey. And so they wanted to give them instructions. And so they didn't write up these instructions right on that day. I mean, these instructions existed before, right? Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we look at, again, I'm sort of known now in my field, I would say, as somebody who studies the Book of the Dead, even though I started not studying the Book of the Dead, studying these Demotic materials. But the Book of the Dead is maybe a really good example because people are familiar with it. And it's exactly what you said. It's a very long, generally, I would say it's a manuscript that's very long, and it's a compilation. So the Book of the Dead isn't one text. It doesn't just start out and say, once upon a time, and then get to the end and say the end. It's not one big narrative. It's a bunch of smaller texts that have been compiled together on individual manuscripts. And every manuscript's different. Some manuscripts only have one composition. Others have 165 compositions. But to your point, this is actually a critical point. Each of those texts were not necessarily initially created for the funeral. They have a huge range and diversity of uses and associated with a bunch of different rituals. So when they're compiled together, yes, people think of it sometimes as an instruction or a guidebook, but I'd like to just point out that these texts have many, many different purposes and features and associated with different uses. And I think the compiling them together just provides a secondary copy, right? So a written copy of all of those uses, possible uses, that then people will take into their tomb. And what I should also just say that, again, to go back to this term sort of quote unquote funerary, most of the major literary and medical papyri that we have from ancient Egypt were also found in tombs. So people weren't just taking books with them into their grave that were just for the afterlife. They were clearly like also sometimes taking their personal libraries, their sort of scholarly libraries, especially if you were like a scribe in a temple or something like that. I mean, some of our most famous texts from ancient Egypt, these literary tales like the Tale of Sinuhe, the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, some of our medical treatises, they were discovered in tombs where some of these people took them with them. So it's not just about, again, funerary text in the sense of these texts were meant for the afterlife. Sure, they were compiling these Book of the Dead spells and these manuscripts. That was part of the purpose, but that's not the only purpose. And really for us, the reason that term funerary text has stuck is because scholars used it to describe, it actually goes back to even to Champollion. Champollion described the Book of the Dead as the funerary ritual, right? So because these things were, in fact, the term Book of the Dead itself, it really, we should be thinking of it as books with the dead, because that term really derives from describing where these things were found, not necessarily the purpose of all the texts.
So they almost want to be buried with existing knowledge.
Exactly. Exactly.
And there is obviously a plan to it. Death is just the start of something. I don't want to forget all the all the magic before that when I get to where I want to go to. So knowledge might have been, in some ways, the most valuable thing they wanted to be buried with.
Yeah, and again, I mean, we're generalizing here, right? So we
Yeah.
have to be a little careful. I mean, the couple of maybe caveats I would say is, number one, this material that we're talking about is really focused through an elite lens in ancient Egypt. So people, who had the means to buy this kind of material. So it's not totally representative of the population. Also, a lot of the people who had the means to buy this material in ancient Egypt tended to work in some part of the state apparatus, which included the religious apparatus. So many of these people who we have their tombs and their texts turn out to be priests or have some kind of priestly positions in ancient Egypt. So it's a bit skewed, the data. So we have to sort of know that. So, but for those individuals, okay, taking those caveats into account, access to this knowledge was really important. And so I just want to point out two things. Number one, in the texts themselves, they often describe this, and they use this ancient Egyptian term rech, which is the verb to know. And they'll say, the one who knows this text, these are the good things that can happen for him. And they'll also have these little postscripts after these compositions that sometimes say, this is a really effective spell. Don't tell it to anybody else, right? Like keep it only among the people who are supposed to know it. And I would also just point out one thing that I think often people forget. And again, this is maybe the background to some of my latest scholarship that will appear hopefully later this year when this volume comes out, is people tend to think of the written versions, these versions that we either have on papyri or the tomb walls or wherever they're written, as the primary version. And I like to remind everyone that in the text themselves, almost all of these texts, they're described as recitations. So they're actually described in the text as things you say out loud. And so the key point I think we need to keep in mind is that the written versions are secondary. So let me give you an example. I often get this. This is a very common question that I'll get in public lectures. They'll say, if you were really poor in ancient Egypt, did you have access to the afterlife? Because, of course, you didn't get a Book of the Dead and things like this. And, of course, I say, of course they did. Of course they had access to the afterlife. And one of the things that are accompanying this is that you don't have to have a written version, because these things were said out loud by your family, by the people who are mourning your passing, right? And by, let's say, your society, your social network. So you can recite these things out loud. And from the ancient Egyptian point of view, that was perfectly effective. But imagine if you're in ancient Egypt and you happen to be somebody with enough money to want to make yourself feel a little bit better about being nervous about dying. Well, then you make these written copies almost as a backup, right? So then you put them on papyrus, you put them on your coffins, you put them on your tomb walls. So again, the material that we're looking at, in a sense, is secondary to these oral traditions, number one. And number two, is reflective of the people who could afford taking steps to make themselves feel better about being worried about what's going to happen.
Yeah, so it's akin to burying a billionaire with all his or her Bitcoin passwords.
Yeah, or I mean, or
Yes.
even, if you look back at, like, let's say the Victorian period, and if you go around here, I live in the suburbs of Chicago, but if you go out to the cemeteries here, and you can see these mausoleums, sometimes mausoleums, with Egyptian themed artwork and decoration, it's very similar to that. Yes.
Yeah. So you see here, fortunately, fragmentary steps from conception to textualization are partially preserved for a relatively little studied corpus from Roman period Egypt, sometimes known by the title the Demotic Book of Breathing. And so talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what I was sort of mentioning before, so maybe let me give a general background to how I sort of approach this, which might be helpful for people who aren't as familiar with this material. But for ancient Egypt, we have this, let's say, 2,500 year continuum where they're writing down texts. Some of those texts they continue to copy, but they keep editing them and adjusting them and changing them and adding to them. And they do that for roughly, let's say, 2,000 years, actually more than 2,000 years, but 2,000 years. And so I'm approaching this thinking, people who are doing scholarship on, let's say, the Old Testament or on the New Testament or on the Quran or any other text where transmission of documents is important, I feel like we as Egyptologists should have a lot to say because we have this really, really rich corpus. I mean, we literally have, if you go into the databases that we have now, and you look up things like the Book of the Dead, for example, we literally have thousands and thousands of manuscripts, copies of these things that span this very long period of time. So if we look at how these manuscripts are being transmitted and try to see the features that are happening in that transmission, we really should be able to provide some comparative models for these other disciplines, right? Because, of course, one thing that if you're a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, what you run into is a very limited amount of evidence if you get before, let's say, 200 BC. If you get pre-Dead Sea Scrolls, there's almost, not entirely nothing, but almost nothing. So what I'm hoping we can do is, as we look at this and we sort of finally, because it's really taken this long, only in the last like 25 years did we have some very large projects who pulled this stuff together in these big databases, and then those databases have been resulting in a lot of publications. Can we sort of see this scope? So I'm looking at it from that. So when I look at these demotic, what some people call the Demotic Book of Breathing or the Demotic Document of Breathing, and again, ask this question, well, where did these come from? Well, what's really interesting about that particular case is that we can trace it directly back to this oral tradition. Now, one problem with saying we can trace it back to an oral tradition, if you look through especially ancient studies, oral tradition tends to be a black box, meaning we just apply it to something we can't really explain very well, and we say, oh, well, it must have come from oral tradition.
Lot of errors in the process too.
And not just errors, but what I would say is variance, because sometimes they're errors, sometimes they're just changes, sometimes the scribe is consciously trying to change it. But so for the ancient world, because we don't have people we can ask, right? We can't go up to an ancient Egyptian today and say, like, hey, what were you thinking when you wrote this in this part? We don't have that oral tradition. However, the graffiti record that oral tradition, because again, there is a slight assumption here, but it's a well-grounded assumption that people weren't copying the text that they're writing in graffiti from another copy, right? That they're pulling the text out of their mind and writing it onto these walls. So what's really interesting with connecting these this Demotic Document for Breathing to these graffiti is it shows you how it was built from an oral tradition, because that is where the oral tradition was recorded. And so what that should be able to do for us, right? It should be able to give us some elements of a model on how oral traditions are transformed into a textual tradition. That then, what I hope is that scholars in other fields can use that. Obviously, they're not necessarily going to be able to go and find graffiti in their fields, but we can see the features of what's happening as those oral traditions are being intextualized, and then generalize some of the principles from that phenomena that can be used across textual studies.
Yeah, so I want to go into another paper, Foy. So demotic and hieratic scholia in funerary papyri and their implications for the manufacturing process. You say here many ancient Egyptian papyrus manuscripts inscribed with funerary compositions contain annotations within the text and margins. Some of these annotations relate directly to the production process for illustrating and inscribing the manuscripts by providing instructions for scribes and artists. Yeah, I find this really interesting. um, so this is so they're providing content and some instructions to replicate content in some ways in the margins.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. So again, you keep in mind, we probably should have some visuals here, but keep in mind, for example, where this particular research started. I must admit, I was working on my dissertation, and one of my dissertation readers, Mark Smith, he's an Egyptologist at Oxford University. He sort of made a note in the margin, like, "Hey, you should see this little note that occurs in this papyrus."
Yeah.
This papyrus that he's mentioning happens to be in ISAC, the institute where I currently work. And it's like a 35-foot papyrus. It has, over 100 individual compositions that have been put together on it as a Book of the Dead. And one thing that's obvious when you look at these, just from looking at them, number one, is that they're not the product of an individual person. Right? Somebody has to make the papyrus scroll. They have to, then they lay it out with a little, like, basically, if you think about an Excel spreadsheet, they lay it out with grid lines so they know where the different parts are going to go. The illustrations are going to go here. The text is going to go here all throughout. And then what they generally do is, this is not true all the 100% of the time, but most of the time they add the text first, and then an illustrator comes along and adds the illustrations next. And we know that because there are actually unfinished papyri where the text has been added and the boxes are blank for where the illustrations are supposed to go. Well, with this particular manuscript, what was the start of that article, that research, is it's really interesting. For the first part of the manuscript, the illustrations and the text are in sync. That is the correct illustration for the correct composition match. But when you get in a little ways, because the layout of the manuscript is rather complex, there's different parts where different illustrations go upper and lower in the different areas on the papyrus. Well, the illustrator missed one of those boxes where they were supposed to put an illustration. So then for a long stretch in the manuscript, the illustrations and the text don't match up. So one thing that this shows you, I mean, there's a million aspects of this, but one aspect that this shows you is that the illustrator is not reading the text to match these up. And in fact, we actually have other documents that prove this to us. There are other documents where in the little corners of the empty boxes where the illustrator is going to put something, there's a number, an ancient Egyptian number. They usually write it in Demotic in this period. And so it's clear that the illustrator had some kind of list. In box 1, you put this image. In box 2, you put this image. And they're not reading the text that's underneath. Well, okay.
So sorry to interrupt, Foy. So the illustrator didn't know. So it's almost sounds like, I write down something and then I hire somebody to put the graphics on it. And the graphic artist didn't know what the content was some ways.
In some ways, yeah. And I'll say too, from the perspective of the history of the book, I always like to point out that you can see here that we already have a division of labor that you find in medieval manuscript production, right? So where you have a rubricator, you have an illustrator, separate from the scribe. Yeah, so the illustrator probably, in many cases, could not read the text that he was adding the illustration to it. And let me explain why, because it's maybe not so straightforward. You have to remember that the compositions that make up the Book of the Dead, they were originally first sort of compiled as what we call the Book of the Dead in about 1650 BC. Okay.
Yeah.
The manuscript that has this note on it, that between the illustrator and the scribe about illustrating, that manuscript's from about 200 BC.
Mm.
So 1400 plus years later. So what that means is that the grammar of the text there is very old and it's archaic, right? So
Mm.
for us today, in an English speaking part of the world, it might
Yeah.
be like us trying to deal with Byzantine Greek. And most people
Or
can't.
or me trying to read Shakespeare.
Yeah,
Would be
Shakespeare,
sort of like
or
that.
yeah, or we could look at all kinds of, like, going back
Yeah.
to, like, let's say classical Arabic or Sanskrit or any of
Yeah.
these older language phases. So the illustrator most likely wasn't trained to read that, right?
Oh
Because
wow. Okay.
it took a lot of education. So what we have in this particular manuscript is, remember, we have this manuscript. The illustrators messed up one of the illustrations, so now it's out of sync. Well, we get to a part of the manuscript where it just so happens that the scribe wrote a column of text and a little bit of it bordered on the next column. So when he
Mm.
wrote the next column, then there was this empty framed in box and it looked like a place where the illustrator was supposed to put an image, but it wasn't. So what the
It's
scribe
empty.
does, it's
Yeah.
empty. And so
Yeah.
he writes this little note and it says, it is not a space for a picture, right? But and now the first question you should be asking is, well, I thought the illustrator couldn't read the text. Well, this is where it's really interesting. The text of the Book of the Dead spells is written in this much earlier archaic grammar all around it. But that little
Yeah.
note, it's written in Demotic, the contemporary language and script of 200
Uh-huh.
BC. So it's not that the illustrator was illiterate.
Yeah.
They were literate in Demotic, but not
Yeah.
in this archaic version, what we call Middle Egyptian. This archaic version, it's also written in a different script in hieratic that's around it. So the
Mm.
illustrator was probably literate in the contemporary language and script of Demotic, but not in this older. And then what's interesting is relatively soon after the scribe makes that note to the illustrator, the images and the text do sync up again for the
Mm.
end of the papyrus. So it does seem to
Yeah.
be working. So you can see that this is a workshop where multiple people are working, they're collaborating together, and they're writing, these notes to each other. And I'll just say that scholarship has led to sort of the reevaluation of other notes that were originally thought to be captions. That
Yeah.
is, you would have an image and you would have this little description above it, above the
Mm.
image. But it turns out that a lot of those aren't captions. They were what we call scribal cues. The
Mm.
scribe was cueing the illustrator and telling them what to put in the image.
Yeah.
So instead of a caption, when you actually have to look at it in reverse, the text was written first to describe what the illustrator was supposed to put there. It wasn't written to
Mm.
describe a picture that was already there. And so part of
Yeah.
that research has led to the reevaluation of that kind of material.
Yeah. This is a tough job for it. So you have content changing, language changing, thousands of years elapsing on the time axis, and you have to sort of put it all together to make some sense out of it. So in this paper, you say an analysis of the corpus of Scholia and Marginalia demonstrates specific manufacturing proclivities for selected groups of texts, while simultaneously revealing a wide variety of possible construction sequences and techniques and others. So this is also sort of evolving in time, isn't it? I mean, we are still talking about thousands of years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are some generalities, right?
Yeah.
But you see differences. So, for example, let me give you some of the generalities, and then I'll describe a couple of the exceptions. In general, we know that the papyrus scrolls were made first, right? So the physical making the papyrus sheets, gluing the papyrus sheets together to form a long scroll. Generally, that was done first. And then generally, they laid out this sort of grid. Then they added the text and added the images. However, there are plenty of exceptions to that. So one of the most famous papyri in the world from ancient Egypt is called the Papyrus of Ani. It's a Book of the Dead. It's very famous. There's a long story to that as well. But what's interesting about that one is there's parts where it's clear that the manuscript was put together. A section of it was inscribed and decorated by this group, and a section of it was decorated separately by this group, and then those two things were pasted together after they were
Yeah.
already produced. So rather than having the full papyrus scroll all in one, we know in certain cases there's also another. Actually, the longest were one of the longest papyri that we have from ancient Egypt. We call it Papyrus Greenfield. Also was put together in sections like that.
Mm.
And another exception is that, as I mentioned, usually They wrote the text and then added the images as a second step. But we do have some papyri where it's clear the images were added first, and then the text was written very
Oh,
carefully
wow. Yeah.
around the images. So, yes,
Hmm.
because we have a long period of time, because there's, I mean, it's just like books today, right? There's not always 100% standard way how to format a type of text, and we have a lot of
Hmm.
variation in that too, and especially now as we get into digital books.
Hmm.
So for the ancient Egyptians, they had those same variations across time and space, and sometimes we know why they chose one over the other, and
Hmm.
sometimes it just seemed to be like that's what that particular scribe wanted to do,
Hmm.
is to produce it in that fashion. So yeah, we have lots of variation in that over time, but there are some general trends that we can pick out of that, and
Yeah.
especially for places and times.
Yeah. It's almost like division of labor and division of specialization, almost
Absolutely.
like in the modern context. And it's a patchwork of information. They unfortunately don't have Chat GPT, I would imagine. I don't know. Yeah,
Right.
it's just a patchwork of differing information in some sense. There's text, there's graphics, there's a structure to it, and where you started, where you ended up, in some sense, is determined by your initial conditions on the papyrus in some ways, right?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, for example, we have cases. I mean, first off, again, a lot of this material, um, when we look at it, it's clear that they're using other source material, right? So when you're talking about material conditions, yeah, we have examples where a scribe is trying to put a text together, and he's looking at, it's just like as a scholar, right? If I'm going to go to write an article, I'm, looking at this book and that book and that book, and I'm pulling pieces out of it. Scribes were doing the same thing. So they had these different papyri that they were looking at,
Hmm.
but sometimes the papyrus had holes in it, and they often made a little note in their manuscript. Like they would say, there was a little note, it said found, destroyed, basically found as a whole. So in
Yeah.
their source material, there was a physical hole, like that either an
Hmm.
insect or a piece of the papyrus broke off. So they didn't
Hmm.
have this word. And so they just made a note in their copy of the text, like, I don't know what that was because it was gone in my
Right.
source material. So yeah, the scribes, they're conditioned by the source material. I'll give you another example, and maybe we can use a comparative just to give people the concrete idea of it. A scroll tended to be a certain length. Now, scrolls were all different lengths in ancient Egypt, but they tended to be roughly, let's say, 20 sheets. That was in the classical period. People wrote about how they were 20 sheets long. So, in terms of the material conditions about what you were going to put on it, the first limit is the size of the scroll.
Hmm.
So, when you think about the size of the scroll, a convenient limit for the size of a book in ancient Egypt was one scroll. And we
One
see
scroll.
this as
Yeah.
a corollary, just to give you a comparison to think about. We see this in the biblical material because there's a reason when we open up an Old Testament today and we see that there's a book that's called First Kings and a book called Second Kings and a book
Hmm.
that's called First Corinthians and a book that's called Second Corinthians and a book that's called
Hmm.
First Samuel and a book that's called Second Samuel. The reason that there's two parts to those books is because the original Hebrew was one scroll, and
Yeah.
when they produced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it took two scrolls. So they had first, so it was a material aspect that led to what we think of now as sort of, in a sense, separate books in
Hmm.
an English version. But these were originally one Hebrew scroll, right? That when they were translated into Greek during the early Ptolemaic period, that done in Alexandria, that ended up taking two scrolls. So yeah, when you talk about the material conditions, one of the things that is interesting is how the length of a scroll and its manufacture and its size
Yeah.
influence the type of material you put on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are some constraints as you go out and write stuff on the papyrus because the size of it is not standardized, so to speak. If I understand this correctly, so I want to go into another paper for really interesting the pragmatics of interment. You say here how the placement of funerary papyri embodied the divine in ancient Egypt. So you say here in the past 20 years, important theoretical developments have had significant impacts on how scholars of the ancient Near East articulate their ideas and interpretations of materiality. The focus of this growing body of literature has often been on the physical form of objects, the importance of the media into which their forms are embedded, and their associated cultural context, what philologists might call the sociology of the text. Yeah, so um, placement. You argue here placement is quite important. Yeah, one would not have thought about that, right? So this is something that you can forget very easily. Yeah. Yeah, talk a little
Yeah,
bit about it.
sure. And again, this is interesting because it ties together a bunch of different traditions in ancient Egypt. It starts again from those Demotic papyri I was looking at during my dissertation study. So these sort of later ones, but they also carry over into some earlier material. So what we find is that in these quote unquote Demotic Book of Breathings, if we want to call them that, which some people do, it's a bit of a misnomer, but we could use that as a shorthand. So these Demotic Book of Breathings, which again, to anybody listening to your podcast, you can think about these as very late versions of the Book of the Dead. It's
Okay.
also not the greatest description, but they're doing the same thing. That is, they're making papyri and they're putting them in the grave with the individual. Now, what we often found, or at least in certain cases, we found two of these manuscripts for the same person. And then you start to wonder, well, why are they making these two manuscripts for the same person? Well, when you look at the back of these manuscripts, on occasion, they will actually draw a picture. Again, we sort of have this multimodal evidence. And in one picture, on one of them, they'll draw a head. And then on the other one, they'll draw a pair of feet. And
Yeah,
what this,
so sorry to interrupt, Foy. In the
yeah,
financial
please.
markets, it's called hedging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, hedging.
Yes.
Exactly. So we have these illustrations, and then we actually have a different set of texts. So we're calling these the Demotic Book of Breathings, but we actually have Book of Breathings that are written in hieratic. And in those, there's very explicit instructions at the beginning or sometimes at the end that say you should put this manuscript under the head, or you should put this manuscript under the feet, or there's actually a third one where they say you should put it under the left arm close to the heart. And so we have these descriptions about where these go. And one of the reasons that you have this happening is over the course of Egyptian history, when you get into the Ptolemaic period, so after, let's say, 305 BC, it's less common to have your own tomb with your own stuff.
Oh,
More often, you had a group tomb. So you would be buried together, often with your family, sometimes your family and friends and associates.
like we do now. Like we do
Yeah,
now in some sense.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some of these could be really big. So you might have thousands of people all
Oh,
in like
wow.
a shared tomb, but that's maybe an exception, but some of them were very large. So what that meant is you often didn't have your own wooden coffin or your own stone sarcophagus and all that. Your materials sort of shrank down to just what they could put around your body. So these papyri then went into the wrappings of your body, and they stood for what used to be decorated on the foot and head end of the coffin. So if you go back to earlier periods in Egyptian history, so like let's say 2000 BC, they would draw goddesses on the end, is usually Isis and Nephthys. And what
Yeah.
it turns out is that these papyri are standing in place for those old coffin boards because the papyri record what do you find when you read them? The recitations of the goddess Isis on behalf of the deceased person. So these papyri then are embodying symbolically the role of Isis and the role of Nephthys in the mythological funeral of Osiris, which again, thousands of years earlier, they were drawing these on the ends of the sarcophagus or the coffin. And then as the funerary goods sort of shrunk down to just your mummified body and maybe a cartonnage covering, they were putting these papyri in at the foot and the head end to stand in for the goddess's mythological role. Because when we see images and when we read texts that talk about the mythology of Osiris, it's Isis and Nephthys who gather his body parts back up and bring him back to life.
Bring them back to life. So could all people from different economic strata, could they afford it?
No, definitely not afford it. I mean, when you say afford it, if you mean buying these papyri and things like that, the answer is no. I mean, these papyri were cheaper than earlier Book of the Dead manuscripts, but still, we only have roughly for the Demotic Book of Breathing, let's say about 50 copies. For the other books of breathing, several hundred. So there's not all that many. So yeah, they would have been out of reach textually, that is the text, for people who were on the poorer side of society. But again, the main thing is that people would recite this material on their behalf. So it didn't change. There's actually a whole, and this is, I don't want to get too much in it on a side tangent, but there's actually a debate in our field that was called the democratization debate. And if you go back early enough into the Old Kingdom, some people thought that the poorer members of society didn't have access to the afterlife because they didn't have these texts in their graves. And largely that has been now disproven, although there are some people who still hold onto that concept. But I would say, in my view, and largely nowadays, that we don't think that that's what happened. So yeah, the lower levels of society also had access to the quote unquote afterlife. That's also access to that. That's a whole separate thing that people are writing about now. But that they had access to the afterlife, again, because it was part of how the Egyptians envisioned their cosmos. And in terms of the text and spells, you could recite these on behalf of anyone. You don't have to have them written down. The written versions were the backup copies.
So they had already passed what we now call the Big Beautiful Bill. I had to say that. Sorry. And so it was, in some sense, it is sort of divided. There is a group of people who could afford a bunch of things, including Isis and Nefertiti's, you say here, and a group of people were just didn't have any of that, right? I mean, that's what we understand.
Yeah, because if you were, let's say, a peasant farmer in ancient Egypt, and you're just, let's say, you're working the fields, in many cases, you're likely not going to have the means to have your own tomb or to even be part of a group tomb, because there's all kinds of, it's just like now, right? Death and taxes. There's all kinds of fees that are involved. You have to buy the rights to be put in a burial plot. You have to buy the material that goes in there. You have to pay the priest to perform the services in the necropolis. You have to pay these fees, and these fees are going to a state apparatus, right? So different parts of the society are sort of extracting out of these fees. So yeah, you had to have money to do that. So from what we can tell, we basically have almost nothing from that poorer side of society, because they were probably just, buried in simple pits, let's say in the desert, versus individuals who had the means to really go all out, you might say. And we have things in between. Of course, like I said, some of these group tombs, it's clear that, a lot of the burials were a little bit more modest, right? Because they're all being put all together, thousands in one tomb. So it wasn't out of reach for everyone. And I hate to sort of talk too much about a middle class in ancient Egypt, because there's a lot of controversy about that. But there was a bit of a divide, right? And the people, like today, right? I mean, we have plenty of people today who can't afford to be buried in a proper cemetery. It's one reason why cremation is so popular, right? Because it's so much cheaper than burial. So if you look at that modern parallel, you can see that still occurs today, right? Like if you want to be buried in a nice cemetery in like one of the big cities, it's not cheap. It's really expensive. And so you have people who can afford that. Then you can have people who can afford like something smaller in their local cemetery. And then you have lots of people today who just go with cremation almost as an economic choice, because they don't want to pay all the fees and costs that are involved in burial. There's actually a current documentary out about that too. But anyway, but it was similar in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, so I didn't know this, Foy. So yeah, I mean, economics is important for me. So I mean, cremation appears to be on the cards. So I want to finish up with your assemblage theory and remix culture in the Book of the Dead. We talked a little bit about the Book of the Dead, a case study of repeated spells. So you say here several Book of the Dead spells are repeated or duplicated in toto in many manuscripts. This phenomenon has long been identified, although rarely studied in detail. However, the broader intertextuality present in the form of shared passages across many spells has received relatively little attention. This article reanalyzes a collection of such intertextual features through a case study of the two Ptolemaic period manuscripts. So talk a little bit about. So I'm sort of on the periphery. I'm understanding this as we have different texts, different contexts that are sort of put together to make a story in some ways. Is that the way to think about it?
I'm sort of. I would be
Yeah.
careful with. I would be very careful to say that they're being put together to make a story, because I don't think that's quite what's going on. But again, we have these large manuscripts, right? So let's say 30 feet long manuscripts. They often have over 100 individual little compositions together. Those compositions, I often call them spells. That's a separate discussion. But so those spells are often
the term spells.
I do
Harry
too.
Potter.
I do too, and I actually use it very intentionally, because if you look at the where that comes from, it meant something to be recited out loud. So I'm actually using it very intentionally for the Egyptian material. And so these spells are often grouped together in sort of thematic groups. So you might have a group of 5 or 10 spells that are sort of about similar things, and then you'll go to another group of 5 or 10 spells about something else, and all the way through the manuscript. So, but they're not connected. Each spell is individual. They're not like, they don't weave into each other. But then what you have is, on these manuscripts, there are different traditions, right, or different patterns that you find with, for example, sequence of spells. Which spells come one before the other, and how many spells. And what you have, as you were mentioning, in certain cases is we'll have a manuscript that will have a version of a composition in one section, and then you might read, 30 or 40 spells, and then they'll have another version of that same spell that you found earlier. And this has been a question, right? Why would they bother writing 2 versions of the same spell? And one thing that I point out in that article is that actually we have some manuscripts, and these go back very early, already in what we call the coffin text. So around 2000 BC, some coffins will have up to 4 copies of the same composition. And there's a lot of questions about like why that happened. And some of the scholarship that's looked at that have looked at little minor variations between the individual copies and said, well, maybe they thought this was a different text because it had this little change or that little change. But there's also issues where you find, in the case that was the sort of inspiration for that article, we had a text that in 6 manuscripts, it has an extra sentence at the end. Now that sentence can be identified. We know it from another composition, another spell. And so people have wondered, like, why is this sentence tacked on to this other spell? Well, one thing that's really interesting.
That's unrelated to the context, or it's sort of in the context?
Okay, well, that's part of what I mentioned, is that sentence that's tacked on, it follows the same theme. So if you're not like, if you just read it maybe superficially, it might just look like, why did they say this here? But it's actually all related to essentially not touching prohibited impure substances, right? So in like one of these spells, they're talking about feces, for example, human feces, that they won't touch it or walk on it in the afterlife and things like this. So there's this little extra sentence that's tacked on. And one of my colleagues had described it like, he described it as, inexplicable. Like, we can't explain this. But one thing that I point out is, number one, we can explain it because it's on a similar theme. But more importantly, what I try to bring in is, this is exactly how these compositions are made, is by pulling together different pieces that the scribe knows. It doesn't have to be from one written text to another. They could have this memorized, right? They could have these little passages and they put them together. And what I point out is, some of these quote unquote repeated spells are produced from that very same manner. And in fact, one of the spells that we're talking about that has this little element tagged on, it is actually, the spell is repeated in the very next spell in the manuscript, and then has a whole new paragraph at the end. And even that we call those different spells, but the core of the spell is identical in both of them. So what this shows, to me at least, is that these scribes are playing with these passages that they know, and they're putting them together in different variations to create new text. That's how the textual creation process actually happens when they're producing these. They're sort of recombining these. And that's why I say I'm using this assemblage theory. This is from a particular article that was talking about students who are, nowadays when a student does this, and if they don't cite the proper sources, right, they're accused of plagiarism. And
Mm.
what this article was pointing out is, in fact, everything we do is coming from something else, right? So when
Yeah.
I write a scholarly article, I'm like building upon 2 centuries of scholarship or more about Egyptology or about this particular topic. Obviously, when we're talking about things, we're drawing from all these other ideas. We
Mm.
are right now live, right, remixing ideas that
Mm.
we've heard and discussed from other people. And so what this sort of theory was looking at is like, how can we theorize a little bit more on remixing, right, and
Mm.
assembling these things together without just looking at it as plagiarizing and stealing. So I was sort of taking that theoretical model and
Mm.
applying it to how these scribes are remixing, right, remixing these texts together, especially at the time. Remember that they don't have a modern conceptualization of authorship or intellectual property rights, and they're merging this kind of material together to create these new types of texts. So that's what I was sort of looking at to
Yeah.
try to,
Yeah.
again, understand how and why they're doing this.
Yeah. So it is called innovation in some ways. So we have a sort of a similar thing going on here for, as you know, um, the AI companies. I won't mention any names. They say, "Oh, we have to get access to the patented data because we cannot go further with our technologies without that copyrighted patented data." And I suppose in Egypt, they didn't have copyright and patents, I would
Correct.
imagine.
Nope.
And so it was freely available to anybody to use. Um, Fortunately or unfortunately, we have patented and copyrighted information. And so now it's a slightly different situation in the contemporary
Sure.
contemporary world, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
totally. I mean,
how does it translate to what was happening before?
well, it's just, I mean, it's like comparing apples to oranges. Again, most of these ancient Egyptian uh, compositions, they didn't even express the author. They weren't even thinking about it in terms of authorship.
It
Authorship to
was
them
just
was,
knowledge. It was
it
just
was
knowledge they want to
knowledge,
put out. Yeah.
and it was a collective practice over time, right? So in the same way, you can look at many medieval manuscripts, or even, again, you can go back to things like biblical manuscripts that
Hmm.
didn't express authorship when they were originally written. So, our modern conceptualization of this, I mean, it really stems out of the 18th century, and you have this statute of Queen Anne, where basically the authors are trying to get rights to their materials because the printers and the publishers are sort of abusing them, right, and
Hmm.
exploiting them. So our conceptualization of this is just very different than it was in ancient Egypt. So yeah, it wasn't, that knowledge is, if you had access to the text, so much so, I'll say this: priests who worked in the temples
Yeah.
were the major libraries. They housed
Yeah.
most of the text. So if you think about, let's say the priest is like your AI company in your parallel, and the temple is like the publisher with all the copyrighted material.
Hmm.
Priests who often worked in these temples took these manuscripts and copies of them home and made them part of their own private libraries. They made their own
Hmm.
copies. They adapted them for their own use. So we have lots and lots of texts that were clearly originally written for a temple ritual context, where
Yeah.
priests have brought them home and adapted them for themselves. So yeah, there was nothing stopping them. We didn't have the sort of legal protections that the AI companies are trying to fight right now
So
to
so
grab all this data.
they're physically copying it,
Yep.
like so they look at the original and then you physically copy all the information onto something else and they
Yep.
take home. Okay.
Yeah, and again, I want to be careful with the term copying,
Yeah.
because it's not like slavishly, quote unquote, copying. They're not always just trying to copy symbol for symbol, but they're like using this text as a source, and
Yeah.
also often other text as a source. And there are certain cases, I won't go into the details because I know we're running low on time, but there are cases where we can see the mistake, how a scribe was copying from a manuscript and then they
Yeah.
realized their error and then they fixed it. So we can see that they were copying from another manuscript directly. They were making some mistakes in how the lines were arranged, and then they fixed it in the copy that they were trying
Yeah.
to make. So we know that yes, they were using this source material.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Foy. I know that we're running out of time here. So, yeah, so the Oriental Institute was renamed, I gather. I've been there long time ago, but things have sort of broadened out, I think, right now?
Yeah, I mean, we still do a lot of what the institute has been known for. So we cover the ancient Middle East, but um, the the ancient Middle East was already global, right? And so even our work has taken on a more global aspect. There's a dig from the institute right now that's happening in Spain, a Phoenician
Mm,
outpost, right? And we expand it to where many people are at our institute are now working in places like Afghanistan and in Central Asia. So it's definitely broadened out. But the main point is that the new name, Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, um, my understanding is that it was chosen so that people who heard it had a better understanding of what it is we actually do, whereas
yeah,
the old name wasn't doing that anymore.
yeah, yeah. And it could be sort of broadened into Africa as
Oh
well,
yeah,
right? So in some ways, yeah.
yeah. Like there's actually the new name has a tagline, West Asia and North Africa, because
Okay.
of course Egypt's in Africa, and many of us at the institute study Egypt. So and Libya and the Sudan, we have people who are also digging, excavating, and working in the Sudan. So yeah, definitely that North African corridor is also a big part of what the institute covers. But I think also just looking at the broader ancient world globally, I think is probably a future that even if we don't have scholars studying it specifically, we're collaborating with other scholars who are doing that.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Foy. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yeah, thanks. Very nice talking to you.